welcome back to the reading I am doing of Lilly Prospero and the Magic Rabbit, my very first book. I am going to be reading a chapter every week, and this is chapter 2. If you want to buy a copy, you can get a copy for 99p as a download, or you can get free UK shipping from the Siren Stories website. It's also available internationally if you order through Amazon. And yeah, I wrote this book. It came out in 2016, and I'm really proud of it, so I'm going to read chapter 2 for you now. Chapter 2. "That's a rabbit!" exclaimed Lilly in surprise when she stepped in the front door. Her mum was sitting at the kitchen table working on her laptop as per usual, except this time in her lap was a large, fluffy, brown rabbit. Lilly dropped to the floor and peered at the rabbit. The rabbit peered back. "Your father and I thought you could use a nice surprise after your first day," her mum said, stroking the rabbit's head and smiling. "We know you were nervous and thought this could help. Isn't he a handsome boy? He's a house rabbit and he's already litter trained and very tame, so he can live in the house with us and sleep in your bedroom." "What's his name?" "I don't know, you have to ask him," she said with a laugh. "But he's all yours. Do you want to take him?" "Cool," Lilly whispered, holding out her hands to the rabbit who eyed her suspiciously. Carefully and gently, she took the rabbit from her mum's lap and held him against her body. He was warm and solid, with a white stripe down his nose and large brown eyes. He smelled of hay, and she could feel his heart fluttering rapidly against her chest. "Can I take him upstairs?" Lilly asked, unsure what the right thing to do is when you're presented with a surprise new pet. "Of course," said her mum with a chuckle. "He's yours, remember?" "Cool. Thanks, Mum," Lilly whispered again, so overwhelmed by the surprise of this new pet that the horrors and confusion of the day seemed to fade away. Carefully and slowly, she carried the rabbit up the stairs and placed him gently on her bed. "So, what's your name?" she wondered out loud, looking him in the eyes with curiosity. "Geoffrey," said the rabbit. Lilly blinked. She looked around and then back at the rabbit. "What?" He cocked his head to the side and said very slowly and clearly, "My name is Geoffrey." "That's a weird name for a rabbit," she said, crossing her arms and frowning. "That's what you're noticing?" "No, but it seemed like a good place to start," said Lilly, feeling a little too shocked to find anything sensible to say. "So, anyway, Lilly Prospero, what do you like to do?" asked Geoffrey, peering around her room and assessing his surroundings with a pensive look on his furry face. "Any hobbies? Skills?" Slightly taken aback by the rabbit's quizzical approach, Lilly said, "Well, I like to draw and paint." "Why?" "Show me." "What? Now?" asked Lilly, completely thrown by this strange development. "No, next week. Of course now," he said, rolling his eyes. "You're bossy for a rodent, you know that," said Lilly, folding her arms. He nodded. He knew. Lilly fetched a sketch pad and pencils from her desk and set them on the floor in front of the observing rabbit. She pulled out some colours and started to draw. Soon the page was filled with butterflies swooping across the page, their turquoise wings trimmed in pinks and golds, swirling patterns and shimmering edges. Sitting back to admire her work, Lilly felt her eyes go funny. She rubbed them, then looked back at the page again. But it wasn't her eyes. The butterflies were actually starting to quiver, to move. "What?" she gasped, staring in shock. Geoffrey jumped down and sat beside her, watching. Soon, wings were starting to pull away from the page, translucent silken colours glowing in the light. The butterflies launched themselves from the page, more and more flying out until her room was filled with shimmering wings. "What the?" she said, ducking as a cloud of butterflies swooped down and whizzed over her head. "The window!" called Geoffrey from under his paws. "Open the window!" Lilly scurried over, worked the catch and flung open the window, letting the breeze drift in and catch the butterflies. Soon the swarm was swirling across the breeze and out into the warm air of the June afternoon. As the last fluttered through, Lilly reached up and closed it again with a clunk. "What the hell?" she demanded, turning on the rabbit. "Impressive work," the rabbit said, nodding with a pleased smile on his face. "I didn't do that." "Well, I didn't," he said. Lilly heard a knock on her bedroom door and jumped as her mum poked her head round, a big smile on her face. "How's it going in here?" "Oh, fine, just just fine, said Lily, her voice too high and her eyes too wide. Lily tried to look innocent, as her mum puzzled and stepped into the room. Does he have a name? She asked, fondling the rabbit's head. Geoffrey. Interesting choice, said her mum, laughing in surprise and sitting on the edge of the bed. So, tell me about your first day at school. It sucked, Lily said as she sighed and rested her head against the wall, closing her eyes as the memories of the day crept back in. There's this girl, Saffron. She's evil. She hates me. Geoffrey sat by her feet, watching her, listening. And I lost my charm bracelet, she said, holding up her bare arm. Oh no, her mum took her wrist. What a shame. It's not left your wrist since you were tiny. I know, Lily agreed. She felt her tears in her eyes and wiped them away with her sleeve. Geoffrey jumped up beside her and placed a soft brown paw tenderly on her leg. I'm so sorry, Mum. Oh, sweetheart, you don't have to apologise. Maybe it'll get handed in, suggested her mum, reaching over and giving Lily's hand a reassuring squeeze. It's not the end of the world, darling. Yeah, maybe, said Lily, sniffing. There's one good thing. I'm entering an art competition. If I win, I get to work at this power company over the summer and design their new logo and get paid for it. I've got to hand in a landscape painting on Friday. Geoffrey shuffled on the spot. That sounds brilliant, enthused her mum, clearly relieved that her daughter had some positives in the sea of misery she usually associated with education. Do you have any ideas? After school tomorrow, can we go to that big industrial plant over on the other side of town? I want to paint the cooling towers, but in pretty colours instead of greys and browns, said Lily. Make something beautiful out of something ugly. That sounds like a wonderful idea, honey. I'll pick you up, she said cheerfully, and kissed her daughter's head as she got up. School will get better, sweetheart. It just takes time. You'll see. Once her mum was back downstairs, Geoffrey said to Lily, What power company? Adamantine Power. Apparently the lady who runs it went to our school or something, she said as Geoffrey's nose whiffled thoughtfully. What's going on with the butterflies? How did that happen? We'll figure it out, just don't tell anyone yet, okay? He said. We need to work out what's going on so we can make sure everything's safe. What's not safe? Said Lily, frowning. It was some butterflies. It's hardly life or death. Well, it is life. When Lily got up the next morning, she felt a surge of excitement mixed with a fog of dread. There seemed to suddenly be a lot more things she needed to deal with beside the ordinary school survival plans. She wanted to find out about Alex, she wanted to win the art contest, and mostly she wanted to find out what her new talking rabbit had done to her drawing. Mostly, she just wanted to avoid Saffron at all costs, but realised with a grim acceptance that that would be the hardest of her desires to actually achieve. Walking to school, she let her brain try to process everything that was going on, when suddenly a car screeched across and pulled up roughly onto the pavement in front of her, driven by a cross-faced young woman with a cigarette between her fingers. The roadside door swung open, and a shock of flaming red hair came into view as Saffron stepped out into the traffic, jumping in a panic as a bus went trundling past her. As she stepped onto the pavement, the car shot back into traffic, leaving Saffron alone and looking shaken in its wake. Are you okay? Lily asked her before she could stop herself. Of course I am, said Saffron indignantly, spinning to shoot Lily a look of fury and embarrassment before storming off towards the school. Lily followed at a distance and became aware she was being watched. The girl with long black braids who'd been standing with her friends and staring at Alex and herself the day before was standing on the other side of the road, watching her, a fiery look on her face. Lily gulped and hurried past, the girl's stare searing into the back of her neck. That was Ashya Patel, came Alex's voice as he appeared next to her, startling her. Just ignore her, she's a freak. Don't forget lunchtime, okay? Lily was about to ask him why Ashya had a problem with her, but before she could, he'd gone again. She looked around in confusion, but he disappeared into the crowd. Keeping her head down and trying to avoid confrontation, Lily settled into her classes quietly and managed to avoid making anybody angry. During geography, as she vaguely listened to Dr. Murray rattle on endlessly about Peru, she absent-mindedly doodled some bumblebees on the edge of her exercise book. Soon she had filled the margin of her page, The notes she'd half-heartedly been making were dwarfed by her artistic efforts as large, stripy bees swirled across the page. "Oh, God," she whispered, as suddenly the bees were beginning to quiver, and their wings were beginning to flutter. Around the room, people were looking around, looking to see where the buzzing sound that was gradually becoming more audible was coming from. Lily stared in horror as suddenly a swarm of enormous, brightly coloured bees shot into the air out of the page, flitting around the room in a haze of stripes and a high-pitched buzz. Everyone started screaming, ducking for cover as the enormous insects whizzed around in a frenzied panic. "Help!" screamed Adele as a swarm circled her. "What's happening?" howled Lee, throwing himself to the ground and covering his head with his arms. "One's on my head!" screeched Maisie, flapping wildly at her hair, panic on her face as a huge insect ripped itself free from her hair and zoomed off again. "Get out!" shouted Dr. Murray, racing to the door. "Quickly!" "What the hell are they?" wailed Jake from beneath a table. "Quickly! They look poisonous," Dr. Murray said, ducking as a bright orange bee shot at his face, cornering suddenly and shooting in the other direction. Saffron screamed in horror, flapping above her head, her hair flying around her wildly as bees spun in the air by her head. Dr. Murray pulled the door open, shouting for everyone to leave. Lily ignored him, staring around the room, terrified that someone had seen where they'd come from. "Come on, Lily!" shouted Dr. Murray, as Lily remained rooted to her seat. She remembered the butterflies from the day before and looked over at the windows. The swooping bees looked like they were starting to panic as they crashed around the top of the room, looking for an escape route. "Lily, out!" Dr. Murray shouted from the door of the classroom, now empty of pupils. "Just a minute," she called. "No, Lily, now!" he insisted. Ignoring him, she got up and ran to the edge of the room to battle with the catch on the window before flinging it open. "Go, go!" she urged the insects, desperate to free them before anything bad happened. Lily swore she heard a "Thank you, Lily," whispered in her ear as the last one escaped. Then Dr. Murray appeared at her side and slammed the window shut. "What were you thinking?" he shouted at her. "Come with me, right now." Lily looked up anxiously and followed the furious teacher out of the room, the door slamming behind her. In the corridor outside stood her classmates staring at her in bewilderment. A teasing smirk was playing across Saffron's face as Lily walked past. She followed Dr. Murray down through the corridors, across the entrance hall, and down the admin corridor. "Sit," said Dr. Murray, gesturing to a scratchy-looking brown fabric chair that sat ominously outside one of the offices, then knocked on the door and disappeared inside. Lily sat, wishing herself anywhere but there, as the fabric chewed at the skin on her thighs. A few minutes later, Dr. Murray reappeared and gestured her inside, then walked away in silence. Lily stood, took a deep breath, and stepped inside the office. Behind the desk was a sharp-faced woman with short steel-grey hair and half-moon glasses. She looked at Lily with a disdain for several moments, as the room filled with uncomfortable silence. "Sit," Lily was instructed for the second time in 5 minutes, as Mrs. Crank pointed a manicured nail at one of the seats in front of her desk. Lily sat. "Lilly Prospero, I am Mrs. Crank, your headmistress. I assumed you are ashamed that these are the circumstances in which we are first meeting." Lily stuttered, but then realised it wasn't a question and quickly closed her mouth and started nervously picking at her thumbnail. "Dr. Murray just explained to me what happened. I now have phone calls to make to pest control, and by the sounds of it, no evidence of what kind of potentially dangerous creature we are dealing with. I'm told they were highly poisonous and foreign in appearance, and that you've released them into the community, completely ignoring instructions from your teacher. You will report to your form room at the end of school for detention. I will require a letter of apology to Dr. Murray, myself, and the pest control people whom you have thoughtlessly inconvenienced with your behaviour. Go and collect your things," said the teacher coolly, looking away from Lily and shuffling some paperwork on her desk, as though it was far more important than the child in front of her. Lily stood and shuffled her feet. "I'm sorry, I was just trying to help," she said woefully. "Now," Mrs. Crank said dismissively, flapping a hand at her and picking up the phone. Lily backed out, then hurried back to the geography room as the lunch bell rang. The door had a "Do Not Enter" sign stuck to it, and her belongings were piled outside. Dismally, she wondered if her life could possibly get any worse, as she picked everything up and headed out to meet Alex. Despite the cat's assistance, I managed to get through reading chapter 2 of Lilly Prospero and the Magic Rabbit. You don't make it easy, you know. You don't. It'd be much easier and nicer reading it without your head getting in the way, and the strong smell of fish. Eh? Stinky breath? So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I will keep reading a chapter every week, and yeah, hopefully it will give you something nice to listen to and you'll enjoy my story. Stop. Thank you very much. Bye.